Today we're looking at participles. I've been asked a few times about participles, and let's make it clear exactly what they are straight away. So participles are supposed to be adjectives. They look like the verb with an ing on the end. If they're a present participle, arriving, containing and carrying are all participles. But if they're past participles, then they look like the third form of the verb, which in all of these examples here is regular: filled, destroyed, ridden, followed. But with an irregular verb it would be the third form, and so for example it would be shot with the verb to shoot. So please remember the third form is what we use for past participle. But in present participle it looks exactly like a gerund, and I'm not completely convinced that it's useful to separate the two, but I'm going to tell you that generally speaking a gerund functions like a noun, the object of the sentence, or possibly the subject, but it functions like a noun, and a participle usually functions like an adjective, which means it modifies a noun. But it's really quite difficult to see sometimes which one it is, and it's debatable. It really is debatable if it's functioning like an adjective or functioning like a noun. So in these two sentences, jabbering on my mobile, jabbering just means like waffling, very similar to waffle from Ways of Talking. Jabbering on my mobile, I didn't notice the oncoming traffic. Here, jabbering on my mobile is modifying the pronoun I, and so it looks like an adjective, it looks like a participle. However, in the next sentence, after jabbering for 10 minutes, I hung up. Here, this is the object of the preposition, and so it looks like a noun. And so, really, even though those sentences look pretty similar to me, a subordinate clause and then a main clause with a comma there, still the word is functioning differently, and so you could call one a gerund and one a participle. But there's really some very difficult cases out there which can be thought of, which really it shows that the line between these two is not necessarily so distinct. Anyway, let's look at present participles and past participles. Now, in the next lesson, I'm going to talk about a more complex, three or four more complex situations when we use them. But today, mostly relative clauses, reduced relative clauses. So we use these participles to get rid of a few words. Yeah, if you look at the first sentence, the train arriving on platform 3 leaves at 3:12. Arriving is clearly, arriving on platform 3 is modifying which train, it's describing which train it is, and so it's like an adjective. But you could add here, the train which is arriving on platform 3 leaves at 3:12. And this is why we call it a reduced relative clause, because the train which is arriving on platform 3 is a relative clause, and we just reduce it. We say the train arriving on platform 3. And it's worth remembering that present participles are only for active reduced relative clauses. I mean active as in not passive. So the train which is arriving, the train is arriving, that's active, it's present continuous active. It's not which is being arrived, which would be passive. It's the train which is arriving on platform 3. Now, it's not so simple that you just look for an ing form and get rid of which and was, because some verbs are state verbs, like contain or want. And with these verbs, here it would be boxes which contain magazines go on the right. Yeah, boxes which contain magazines go on the right. But when we use the present participle, we just say boxes containing. And so remember that state verbs, they can certainly be reduced to present participles in these relative clauses. You can say people not wanting to come to the theatre don't need to buy a ticket, or something like that. People not wanting. And here it's people who don't want, and you're reducing that relative clause. Want is a state verb, so who don't want, it goes to people not wanting. And in the last example, the attackers who were carrying weapons were shot immediately is active. The attackers who were carrying is active. And yeah, I just wanted to show you here that it equally applies for past tense sentences. The attackers who were carrying weapons were shot immediately. And so yeah, just because it's called a present participle, don't think that it's only for present tenses. That was my point. It's equally true for past tenses, and you can use them in reduced relative clauses in past tenses as well. Now, past participle, perhaps we should actually call it the passive participle, because this is the passive one, just like as this was the active one, this is the passive one. And so there is a cup which is filled with water on the table. Now, which is filled with water. This is a passive construction, to be filled with water. And so it's not being used actively here, it's being used passively. There is a cup which is filled with water. Or the house which was destroyed. Passive, past simple passive, yeah? The house which was destroyed by fire will be rebuilt. And you can see some passive here as well in the future. The bike, now here I wanted to show you two other forms which you also see which complicates matters, but there is a passive continuous form which looks the same as the passive gerund. Notice that really, because being done, being in third form, is the passive gerund. And I think there's an argument here that there's not much difference between the passive gerund and the past participle in a continuous form. But think about what we're missing here. It's a reduced relative clause. The bike which was being ridden by the youngest child was the fastest. Or the car which was being followed by the police car was stopped. We don't need which was. We can just say the bike being ridden or the car being followed. Okay? And we use that form which is very similar to the passive gerund. Okay, another case when we can use these participles, which you probably have all already heard about, is the difference between ed and ing adjectives. I think this is often taught as something different, but actually the difference between ed and ing adjectives is we're talking about participles, and we're talking about the difference between present participles, which would be this one, and past participles, which would be this one. And so what's the difference between a boring man and a bored man? This shows us that we can use participles just before a noun. Yeah, a boring man is a person who bores you, active. But a bored man is a person who is bored, passive. An embarrassing friend is a friend who embarrasses you, active. An embarrassed friend is a friend who is embarrassed. Okay, and so really this ing and ing, this ing and ed endings is exactly the same as participles. Now, one more thing I wanted to mention was verbs of perception. This is because they're also very often reduced relative clauses, and you very often see them with participles. And you can see here it's usually the ing participle. Okay, so for example, I saw two men who were fighting. I saw two men fighting. He heard the church bells which were ringing. He heard the church bells ringing. And I noticed two guys acting suspiciously. I noticed two guys who were acting suspiciously. Okay, so another thing just to remember is that we do see these participles very often with verbs of perception. If you want to know the difference between I saw two men fight and I saw two men fighting, there's a very good website, Pearson have a good page on this, but the difference is actually really simple. I saw two men fight means that you saw the whole fight. I saw two men fighting means that you were in the middle of watching the two men were in the middle of their fight when you saw it. Okay, so the ing form, the present participle, makes it sound like you were in the middle of it. It makes it sound simultaneous. And this is important because we'll talk about simultaneity in the next lesson on participles. But this is simultaneous. You were in the middle. It's like continuous form for that reason. I saw two men who were in the middle of fighting. He heard the church bells which were in the middle of ringing, and I noticed two guys who were in the middle of acting suspiciously. Very similar here to continuous tenses, and yeah, we'll talk more about this in the next class. So please stay tuned for the next lesson, and any questions, put them under the video. I'll do my best to answer them, and I hope to see you all soon.